大家好，欢迎来到 Zodiac Trader。今天我们来聊一下这个 Ray Dalio Lately on China。这一个文章呢比较重磅，所以今天呢我会把这篇文章读完，然后highlight一些比较重要的部分，让大家去理解Ray Dalio 的一些想法。那当然 Ray Dalio 他是非常亲中，然后也给中国经济说很多好话。那我估计某种程度来说，中国政府把他视为好朋友，但明显这种时代结束了。现在连 Ray Dalio 都开始唱空开始跳反。那今天这篇文章的名字叫 In China, the 100-year storm on the horizon, and how the big cycle forces are playing out。那好，他这边一共列举了5个比较重要的 big forces， 就是他认为会影响到中国经济的5大力量。那我认为这篇文章是值得阅读的。那我现在开始做一个阅读，然后后面呢去做一个分析啊。A few years ago, President Xi Jinping started warning that a 100-year big storm is coming. As is typical of the early day of a hurricane, one can now feel it. The circumstances and the mood in China have disruptively changed to become more threatening. These changes are mostly due to big cycle forces. The most joyous and productive environments are ones that have freedom, civility, and creativity, and ones in which people can make their dreams into great realities with prosperity that is shared by both people. 这边开始对了，这边开始说中国经济不是特别的自由了。These happened in China from around 1980 until around 5 years ago. It is quite typical for such booms to produce dead bubbles and big wealth gaps that leads the booms to turn into bubbles that turn into busts. That happened in China at the same time as the global great power conflict intensified. So China is now in a post-bubble and great power conflict part of big cycle that is driven by the 5 big forces that have changed the mood and environment. In this piece, I will first describe in brief how the big cycle has transpired over roughly the past century, and then I will explain the current picture of what is happening today, with a focus on the challenges that China is facing. This history and these dynamics are complex and important to world history and the global order. Everything I write here is how I see it based on my own experience, relationship, and research. 所以这边提到5个比较重要的趋势，以及他的一些个人的观点。How the big cycle in China transpired to create the condition from the beginning of the PRC through the current conditions. 因为现在开始来讲建国时代的事情。In the 1930 to 45 period, there was the last 100-year big storm, which was driven classically by the confluence of 1, a debt bust that triggered a global depression, 2, a civil war in China between rightist capitalists and the poor leftist communists, which ended in 1949 when the communists won. 3. International great power conflict war that ended in 1945 when the United States and, to a much lesser extent, Great Britain and Russia won, creating the American-led world order. 4. Many destructive acts of nature. And 5. Big technological changes. The period ended in a classic way. They end with a debt and economic collapse. One side winning over the other in a great international war and the New World Order beginning in 1945, and one side winning over the other in the Civil War and the new domestic order beginning in 1949. 这边基本讲了这个文化大革命左支派跟这个左派之间的一个斗争然后还有讲到这个建国时代建国时代中国的建国，还有这个无产阶级是怎么样颠覆掉资本阶级这个大的一个历史的一个周期。From 1949， 这时候开始建国了，中国建国。The year the new domestic order was created, the year the PRC being formed, until 1978, the year Deng Xiaoping came to power. There was a typical post-war consolidation period led by Mao. In a way, he wanted there a domestic economic policy that was a communist, a domestic political policy that was oppressive, dictatorial, and designed to purge the opposition, and a foreign policy that was isolationist. That and big destructive acts of nature led to many big challenges and big bad periods and few economic and technological advances. Mao and that era died in 1976. 所以就在讲建国，从49年到78年的时候，到后面这78年之后，邓小平才执掌，才开始做改革开放。但这49年到78年呢，就是一个灾难的周期。这个时候呢，中国采取一个封闭的、隔离式的，然后还有包括这个文化大革命等等的一系列的问题，导致内部的经济出现重大的一些挑战啊。那我们都知道发生了什么，这个地方我就略过不讲。When Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he reduces the one-man control and repressions, increased collective leadership, replaced hardcore autocratic communism with more free markets and increasingly larger doses of capitalism, and opened China up to foreigners to learn and earn from them. It was like sprinkling water on fertile ground that led to great blossoming. From 1978 until Xi came to power, there was a classic capitalist rejuvenation that led to a boom in which the economy, living standard, and debt all grew greatly. At the same time, China was not perceived by other countries to be a threat to the leading of great power, the United States, and its world order. As a result, China had a joyous and productive environment in which there was a relatively large increase in freedom, civility, and creativity, and in which people could make their dreams into great realities, and most people benefited. Though the rich benefited more than the poor. As is typically the case, these policies also produced greater wealth gaps and greater amount of corruption that began to end when Xi came to power, not because he came to power, but because of where China was in, its big cycle, and how the new leadership approached it. 这边就讲到邓小平开始做改革开放，那这段时间呢，经济开始蓬勃发展，然后呢，贪污呢，还有贫富差距悬殊呢，也开始不断的往上剧增增加。那这个时候呢，中国经济呢聚集了非常多的这种开放性的要素，有自由，有一定程度的民主，还有这个创造力，那是最好的一个时代。那这边来看 ，When President Xi came to power in 2012, a roughly 11-year transition began that brought China from what it was like in 2012 to what it's like today. I was lucky to see it up close. At the start of his presidency, Xi and the leadership main goal were to reform the economy and eliminate corruption. For most of Xi's first 5-year term, there was still an openness to outside thinking. B, a strong desire to further reform the economy by making it more market-driven and building and reforming the capital markets. And C, strong actions taken to eliminate corruption. The senior leaders chosen were the one who were inclined to do those things. Of course, how to do these things were debated, and some people benefited from the change while others were hurt by them. So, in Xi's first term, there was a movement to consolidate power via a move to core leadership. These became most clear in the leadership changes that accompanied the shift from the first to second 5-year term under Xi. In 2015, Xi put out his bold 2025 plan, which was viewed as aspirational by the Chinese and threatened by Americans. China could no longer hide power. Americans viewed the Chinese as a threat by the time Donald Trump came to power in 2017 and Xi began his second term. In 2017, the great power conflict had begun. In 2019 to 2020, COVID-19 emerged. At the same time, the debt bubble and the wealth gap had grown. So the classic convergence of forces led to the formation of the 100-year big storm. In 2021, about halfway through Xi's second term, China's domestic debt bubble burst and international great power conflict intensified. At the beginning of Xi's third term in October 2022, China's leadership changed from reform-minded globalist to loyal communist nationalist. and purchasing crackdown ensued, which brings up until now. I will soon describe what things do now look like. Before I do, I want to drive home the point about how the big cycle is playing a big role in driving what has happened. 这边就讲到习是如何上台然后呢，这一位他是怎么样的一个经济政策导致这个新的一个周期开启。那我们可以看到2019到2020年随着疫情的爆发这因为的一个经济的大转折，然后他开始了第二任期，这个时候中美的关系开始逐渐的升温甚至是对立。那这个东西呢是现在的一个持续的趋势。那整个经济制度也从一个非常自由的相对自由非常繁荣的这么一个经济走向了一个比较集中这么保守式的这种communist 尤其是民族主义的这种系统里面。The hand she was dealt, and how now he is choosing to play that hand. A Chinese leader, historian, and friend of mine told me several years ago that condition of the time create the type of leader that emerges because of the revolutionary process pulls out the leader who suits the environment. 这估计是老王跟他说的the historian in other words， 因为以前老王是做这个历史的非常懂一些历史，喜欢看法国大革命那老王不知道是谁，就自己查一下 YouTube。 In other words, how the times are transpiring determines the leader even more than the leader determines how the time are going. He gave me the book, The Role of the Individual in History by Russian political philosopher Georgy Plekhanov, which you might find it interesting. When Henry Kissinger was writing his book on leadership and how we talked about what makes a great leader, he made the same point, that what made a great leader at the time depended on what was needed at the time. For example, Konrad Adenauer, Germany chancellor immediately after the World War II, was a great leader for a country that was defeated after the war because he knew how to be both differential and pushy enough to deal with both. First, the dominant powers that Germany had just came out of horrendous war with, and second, a domestic population that was defeated and destroyed in most ways. My point is that what is happening now in Xi's leadership must be looked at within the context of the big cycle. In other words, it is important to distinguish between the hand that Xi was dealt and how he has been choosing to play it. It is also important to understand what is happening now and how Xi is playing his hand without judging these things, because judging them can stand in the way of understanding them. My goal is only to understand what's happening and what's likely to happen, and I don't want to let judgments stand in the way of doing that. 他就是说现在基本上这个政策呢会越来越主观，然后呢他只是想要去描述会发生什么那当然这个朋友给他的一些德国的书籍就讲到这个历史时势造英雄嘛那么历史会选择最适合他的一个领袖那这个尤其他举了个例子，就是德国当时的这个一个 chancellor 他在二战中是怎么帮助德国走出这个债务的问题的那我们继续。As I see it, the template to keep in mind is that capitalism, with or without Chinese characteristics, produces credit that creates spending power, which when used well unleashes creativity and prosperity, which produces the upward wave in the cycle. But it also inevitably creates a lot of debt and wealth gaps. And when the debt becomes too large to pay off, and there are big wealth gaps, that causes the cycle to burst when there is a lot of debt and big wealth gaps at the same time as there are great domestic and international power conflicts and or great disruptive changes in nature, like droughts, floods, and pandemics, which China is especially prone to, and great changes in technology. There is increasingly likelihood of a 100-year big storm that is the current environment in China. Destiny put Xi in a position he is in, and now How he plays his hand will reflect where he is coming from, motivating him to do what he does, which will have big influence on what happens. 所以这边就提到了他为什么认为接下来是100年的这个选秀嘛，100年的这个大风暴为什么会来临？因为有众多的一些因素啊，包括了这个疫情啊，包括了这个科技的发展等等。History shows that in all countries, all the time during these very difficult 100-year storm-like period, leaders go much autocratic policies because the turn becomes great internal conflict and disorder. And typically there are forced changes of leadership that those in power might fight against. This is especially true in the Chinese culture. Losing the mandate of heaven is something everyone is aware of. A Chinese scholar told me that 38% of Chinese emperors died of unnatural causes while in power. There are many dynasties that went through such a big storm period, and different philosophies the emperor used to guide them. Legalism is the belief that people are motivated by self-interest, especially during difficult times. So they must be required to strictly follow the emperor and his rules, especially big storm period. The legalist approach with Marxist and Maoist characteristics appears to be an approach Xi has chosen. To be clear, I don't think what it is exactly is clear to either non-policymaker or policymakers. They appear to be figuring out a dialectic. For example, I know that entrepreneurship and open markets remain much more open than my characterization of a legalist approach with Marxist and Maoist characteristics would seem to imply. While people can debate the merits of Xi and Chinese government creating a fearful and strict control environment to get people to behave the way the government wants them to behave, just as people can debate the merits of the American government's more democratic and disorderly approach. It is more important to see what's happening as objectively as possible than to be quick to pass judgments on it. Here is the current picture of what is happening as I see it. The current picture of what is happening in China. I'll describe these in terms of what I see as the 5 big forces that drive the changing world order and tend to evolve in big cycles. There are how well the economic system works, how well the internal order works within countries, and how well the world order works between countries, along with acts of nature and technology. First, there are big doubts and economic problems that are depressing economic activities, prices, and psychology. Domestically, it is a very difficult time for China financially because many people are suffering the negative wealth effects of falling A. real estate prices, B. equity and other asset prices, C. employment, and D. employee compensation. Also, there are debt and financial problems that exist in many companies that many local governments that are drags, which, if not properly dealt with, will have bad consequences for a long time. These things would have contributed to the mood having become more dour. How should these problems be dealt with? To me, as a macroeconomic thinker who approaches such debt and economic problems more like a doctor than an ideologue, the leadership needs to have a debt restructuring, which it should do via engineering a beautiful deleveraging. See my book, Principles of Navigating Big Debt Cycles, Big Debt Crisis, which I'm giving here for free. If you're interested in delving into what it looks like, or it will have the lost decade like Japan's, while many people think policymakers should ease monetary policy to create more credit, I think they correctly view creating more credit and debt like giving an alcoholic a drink to help ease withdrawal problems. I believe that they should engineer both. First, a deleveraging, which is deflationary, depressing, and will reduce the debt burden. And second, an easing of monetary policy, which is inflationary, still stimulative, and will ease the debt burden. So that's deflationary way of reducing debt and the inflationary ways of doing its balance. This is what I mean by a beautiful deleveraging. In my opinion, this should have been done 2 years ago, and if not done, will probably lead to a lost decade. I think some of the economic leaders, especially Those who did this under Zhu Rongji understand how to do this, but it is very difficult and politically dangerous to do so because it engineers big changes in wealth, which was politically challenging, especially during a difficult time because people squawk. In my opinion, if the leadership doesn't execute a beautiful deleveraging, China will have a Japanese-style lost decade with Marxist characteristics. 这边就非常重要。他首先讲到第一个重大的问题是这个 debt problem 债务危机。那他认为中国要度过一个债务危机，必须要进行漂亮的债务重组，必须进行一个漂亮的去杠杆。那这个我后续会做一些视频来讲这个漂亮去杠杆是怎么回事。那最主要他认为呢，要两股力量去操作。第一个呢，需要进行一个就是债务上面的重构，然后在债务上面重构之后呢，也要缩减政府的一些开支，然后去减少经济的一些杠杆，然后把房价降下来。然后同时在第二步的时候要去做一个财政这个货币上面的宽松，所以你是财政紧，但货币是松，所以你有两股力量。那第一股力量是比较这个通缩型的，第二个力量是基于通胀的，所以这两股力量刚好均衡，那就会形成一个漂亮的一个去杠杆，就这个经济体呢也不至于说马上迅速的过冷，是这个意思。如果他不去做这个 beautiful deleveraging， 不去做这个去杠杆，那么中国非常有可能，中国经济会掉到一个类似日本经济的这么一个债务陷阱，非常非常大的一个失去了20-30年。那我们继续。The aging population issue is a heavy weight for those who are old, for their children, and for the government finance and social issues. The average age of retirement is 53, and the average age of death is 84. So people without incomes have to be taken care of for 31 on average. This is made more difficult because the previous one-child policy means that one person has to take care of two parents. This has been a depressant in the mood and the financial situation, while the retirement age should be raised and a social support system, include old age care, should be improved. Neither is happening at an adequate pace. That is mostly because people don't want their retirement ages to rise, so doing that is politically undetainable, and because the government bureaucracy is moving very slowly, especially now that most government officials are reluctant to take bold actions because those can be politically disruptive, as they were in other countries, most notably France, and people's work. So it takes courage. Also, with the workforce declining and old people getting ill and passing away, this is burdensome and depressing. Once again, this is likely to remain a burden unless the government deals with it with a more forceful way. 在这边提到了这个老龄化，也提到了这个大部分的这些官员是没走因为很害怕这个在改革中遇到的巨大阻力，所以大部分的像法国的一些官员是没有办法就推进这个改革的那如果没有改革的话，老龄化所造成的一些问题，包括以前的这个少子化，还有包括这个我们现在以前的这种只能够生一个孩子的这个政策同时限制了中国经济的发展。Second, the internal wealth gap and the resulting conflict over wealth and values are intensifying, which is fear-inducing. The internal wealth gap has led to the government's push for common prosperity and government-directed, seemingly arbitrary rather than rule-based actions. These moves appear to some people to be anti-capitalist, while to others they are simply the government's messages to people to stay out of politics and to do what the leadership wants them to do to help society. In any case, it's fear-inducing and oppressive, especially for capitalist elites. On a recent trip to China, my Chinese friends reminded me that throughout Chinese history, it has typically been the case that you cannot be rich and be the government official. The merchant capitalist who sought financial gain was traditionally assumed to be dangerous, greedy, and easily corruptible, and not allowed to be in the government. It wasn't until 2002 that these merchant capitalists were allowed to become the Communist Party members. That was during the reformist period. Now it is no longer as glorious to be rich, as is increasingly the case around the world, but more so in China. There is a greater inclination to think that the rich are selfish and corrupt. Purging and rooting out corruption is also going on in most areas. perhaps most notably in the military. In other words, it's a time of big policy and strict enforcing of what should be done and how people should behave that has become threatening to some. With the pendulum now swinging in a more legalistic, autocratic, communist direction, naturally people are asking how far it will go. It will lead people to probably exaggerate the probabilities. My study of Chinese history and my studies of similar histories and analogous periods has put in my mind, which are also in some other minds, the memories of an anti-rightist capitalist campaign that led to the persecution of such people, the confiscation of wealth, the shutting down of stock markets, the enforcing of strict foreign current exchange controls, the restrictions against living in China, and the questions about whether that is where China is headed. People remember the Civil War and the changes after 1949. The elites who are experiencing these pains to a greater degree are more concerned. It appears that the elites are most concerned and least supportive of Xi, while many who feel Xi is trying to take care of them from being exploited by the elites that are strongly supportive of him. It appears that Xi and the leadership think that most of those people who are discontented are spoiled and appreciative of how much better off that they are than they were not long ago, and that they need to be toughened up, get disciplined, and get in line with the program to help others. This has contributed to the mood becoming more dull and pessimistic. No one knows how far the pendulum will swing back toward more Maoist and Marxist way of doing things. The absence of clear communication from the leadership about motivation behind their actions and where they are headed is leading to greater amounts of imaginary speculation than there would be if there were clearer communication. The impediment is that communicating more directly is not the Chinese leadership traditional way of doing things. Is understandable. China's new premier Li Qiang's decisions to discontinue press conferences for the first time in 30 years, consistent with the move to lesser clarity rather than greater clarity at this time of greater risk. 好，这边主要就是讲呢，其实有很多政治上面的事情，就是他认为呢，现在这个经济的这个走向啊，是会变得比较相对来说会紧张很多啊，因为意味着这种一人的体制会导致整个经济体的出现更多像是以前改革开放之前的场景。然后呢，很多的包括他的商人朋友都提醒他说，现在政府的观点就在于限制富人、削弱富人，所以过去的这些精英跟富人呢，现在呢非常战战兢兢，生怕呢就在揣摩上意害怕去得罪上面的人，所以现在呢，他可以就是Ray Dalio可以预示到，可以想象到呢，未来呢，中国呢将会是更加的，就是封闭，那么更加的这种集权化。OK， 那么 Third。The great power conflict between China and the US is having a big negative effect. It is causing foreign investors and businesses and domestic investors and businesses to want to diversify, to leave China, and to fear being discriminated against globally for being friendly to China. In trade and capital flows, a cat and mouse game has developed that has led companies and people to move to neutral countries and try to appear to be non-Chinese or not Chinese sympathizers, so much so that Chinese are having problems getting other countries and companies to accept them being there and or invest in them. For example, Chinese businesses setting up Mexican companies and exporting to the US to get around tariff on Chinese goods is leading the US to explore moving to look through the entities to identify the beneficial owners to catch them pushing and punish these entities. The TikTok identity pursuit game is the most attention-getting example. even in the industries and world market that China has become very competitive in, most obviously electric vehicles, batteries, green energy, solar and wind products, chips, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space, and etc. There are geopolitical conflicts that blend with economic conflicts, so they are increasingly run by governments. The not too long ago old days of free and open markets and the idea government interference in them is bad, are gone for the foreseeable future. These will affect China because it has excess capacity and will be accused of dumping, leading to big tariff increases as protectionism and nationalism come back into fashion as they did in 1930s. The Chinese economic model is based on gaining an increasing share of world manufacturing output, which has a good chance of not happening because other countries that in the past have imported Chinese goods are more likely to prevent them with rising tariffs. In addition to economic clashes with the West, there are cultural clashes. They were described to me by a Chinese leader as mutual cultural ignorance with evolutionary change. He explained that first, the Anglo-European culture extended by Great Britain's passing dominance to the US is having problems accepting the rise of China as Chinese Asian culture. Second, there are failures of the two sides to understand and accept the different approach. The third, Western culture is more zero-sum than win-win and more inclined to slip into lose-lose wars. I agree with his assessments and find it tragic. It is certainly the case that the Chinese fight wars differently, thinking about art of war, fighting to win by focusing on the pressure points that can weaken or hurt the other side without even being seen. For example, if one were conjecturing how the Chinese might play the existing geopolitical situation if the conflict rises, because the US is overextended in two wars, the Chinese might think about where there could be a third front, like a war in Asia. Something like a conflict with the Philippines or North Korea. That would put the two sides in the US election in the awkward position of having to step into the third conflict, which would be unpopular in the US or not appear strong enough. Almost all leaders on both sides believe that the other side is working to destroy the other and are working to be able to destroy the other. They are in an intensifying personal dilemma. To be clear, I don't believe that either side wants to provoke the other side, and I do believe that greater understanding and respect for the other culture is required. But more than that, each should ask the other, what are your greatest existential fears? And work with the other side to figure out what can be done to alleviate them. Without that, the odds of some sort of devastating war within the next 10 years are high, and people are positioning themselves with that possibility in mind, which itself is very damaging. 这边就提到说，现在的中国呢，面临有很多的身份的危机，那包括美国政府现在也做很多猫抓老鼠游戏，尝试抽丝剥茧，把中国的控股方还有后面的常见人把它找出来。所以对于很多人来说呢，现在呢要去融入国际的交易环境、国际的贸易环境是越发的困难。在这样的一个大环境下呢，其实当然中国不同声音会认为，这个西方的价值观，尤其是这个盎格鲁撒克逊的这种民族，他们认为这种民族性导致呢，他没有办法跟中国的崛起共荣，因此呢，就出现了一个穷途的局面，一个穷途悖论。也就是说，现在美国面临2场战争，那美国肯定会去犹豫要不要再去加入亚洲的第3个战场。那如果是这样的话呢，对于美国的竞选是不利的，因为美国呢这个时候同时在承担3场战争，就是有可能接下来在北韩，有可能接下来本来就在俄乌战争，或者是在以色列，那这些几场战争呢，可能对于美国来说是一个比较巨大的挑战，但这个时候雷达里奥去说呢，这个时候我们需要学会去更加去共融这些文化，然后呢去学会和即便是敌人或者是即便去跟 对方去进行共处，不然的话呢，人们会去恐惧这10年内会有一个更加上升的这种战争的局面啊，但这样的一个状况是非常的危险的。4. Climate and climate-related issues are big, threatening, and top of mind. They extend from having droughts, floods, and pandemic now to not having enough clean water. They will probably cost a lot and hurt a lot. 啊，这边就讲到气候问题啊、饮水问题、食品问题等。啊 ，5th, while technology development has always been a critical defining force, and while it is well known that whoever wins the technology war wins the economic and geopolitical and military wars, this has never been truer than now. And China and the US are the leaders and big adversaries. Throughout the history of war, the desired path has been secretly build the technology that is strong enough so that showing it to the opposition will make the opposition become submissive. Watch the movie Oppenheimer for a refresher. That is certainly going on. There are many technologies that both China and the US are putting huge amount of talents and resources into using their different approaches. One more top-down, government-directed, and one more bottom-up, corporate capitalist, some of which we know about, for example, chip, AI, quantum computing, outer space, cyber batteries, clean energies, electric vehicles, robotic, etc. Some of which China is in the lead on, and some of which the US is in the lead on, and none of which we can anticipate exactly how it will transpire in the future. I won't digress into looking into these because it would take too long, and now is the time to step back up to look at the big picture. For the previously described reasons, it is understandable why President Xi believes that there is a 100-year storm on the horizon. That assessment seems to right to me. At the same time, I'm not certain of anything other than that. I am trying to be as objective and helpful as possible in bringing about understanding. China is an enigma that I am trying to make less enigmatic. I have been made very lucky to see up close for nearly 40 years for what has happened in China, United States, and China-US relations, all of which I care about deeply, and I have found it all intensely interesting and important to watch it. It seems that we all have been affected by the supposed Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Since I published this, a number of people have asked what I think about investing in China. I find high-quality China assets very attractively priced, and I have done very well investing there. I also have great affection and respect for the Chinese people and culture. For these reasons, I remain committed to my meaningful work, meaningful relationship, and investing there, and to trying to improve mutual understanding through my radical truthfulness. OK， 最后他做一个总结，基本上就是说第5点就是中美之间的各个角力，还有科技之间的竞争。那现在来看呢，其实就回归到最后他所说的 100-year storm on the horizon， 就是某人说的这个100年未有之大变局啊。那最后呢，再把这个话圆回来说，他是一个只是从他的角度出发，他非常在乎就是中美双方，然后呢，他仍然是投资中国市场，认为这些中国资产仍然非常具有吸引力。但我应该说，这种整篇文章还是能够透露出他对中国现状跟经济的一个非常深的一个忧虑啊，还有他认为现在的局面已经开始有点失去控制了啊。那总的来说呢，我们就今天通过这种方式去对雷达里奥的一些文章进行深入的剖析。那么下次有机会呢，我会做一些专题来解析中国的债务问题。那今天节目就到这边结束。如果喜欢我的节目，请订阅、点赞，并且打开小铃铛。我们是没有任何 bullshit 的财经频道。我们下期节目再见，拜拜。